Hello everyone, I'm bringing you the Mannequin of the Month for May 2024 today. As is typical, the topic we're going to talk about here, the kit we're going to talk about, was chosen via a poll over on Patreon. And the topic which came top of the poll this month is the kit of a British Infantry Lieutenant serving in Burma in the latter half of 1944. And that's what we're going to talk about here. There's not a huge amount really to mark this out as a kit of an officer. We'll talk about the reasons for that as we run through the details of the kit. But that's what we're going to talk about in some detail here. Most of the kit we're looking at has been covered on the channel previously, but just slightly different setup here. And we'll talk about that in detail, of course, as we run through this. We'll start at the top as we normally do with headgear. And we have here a slouch hat. Now, at this time, the troops of 14th Army serving in Burma commonly wore the Mark II steel helmet, but you do still see the slouch hat in use as well. It really depended on unit and operation. So I thought we'd change the look here. Generally, when I put together kit for 14th Army, I tend to include a helmet, so I've included the hat here instead. And we'll have a look at more details of that as we turn this round. You'll see more details of it. You can see the puggery round at the front here and the brim, which is secured up at the side with a press stud snap up at the side, and we'll see details of that as we move this round, of course. The basic uniform consists of Indian jungle green clothing. Now, this is a later part of the design. This is a bush jacket which was introduced in 1944, as I remember. And this was produced in jungle green as opposed to the khaki clothing which had been produced previously. It's made of a cellular material, basically what was commercially referred to as Airtex, the brand name Airtex. So it's very lightweight and in theory breathable, but it does absorb a lot of water. It doesn't really wick sweat away. And these were more popular than the battle dress blouse. There was a battle dress uniform produced with the blouse made of this material and the trousers made of green drill. The trousers would be worn with the bush jacket as well. This was far more popular than the blouse, which tended to ride up and be uncomfortable to wear. The bush jackets as we have here were quite often worn tucked in as a shirt, basically. There was also an Angola wool shirt that was worn as well, and that was very, very popular too. We've looked at that previously. I've included that on previous mannequins. So just looking at a different example here, another example of the clothing which was available at the time in Burma, and that is the jungle green bush jacket which we have here. One untucked in this instance. It can't fit the trousers I have on the mannequin. Unfortunately, the waist is too big, even on the smallest one I've carved down a bit. I don't want to carve any more of it off really, but often, as I say, these were worn tucked in as a shirt rather than being worn outside the trousers. Quite common to see. Just mention that detail here. You have two breast pockets, as you can see here, no pleats or anything. If they are worn tucked in with equipment and so forth over them, it's a good way of marking these out from the blouse. When they are tucked in, they look quite similar to the blouse, but the blouse has pleated pockets, the bush jacket doesn't. And then you have pockets on the hips here as well. You can just see the pocket flap there. No button or anything on that, just a patch pocket stitched on the outside with a flap with no button, and obviously two patch pockets on the chest there with single button flaps. The buttons are made of coconut shell, a common material used to make buttons for Indian clothing, Indian-made clothing at the time, readily available and obviously a local resource as well. Of course, a lot of the equipment issued in the Far East at the time, not only to Indian troops, but British troops as well, was Indian-made because it's being made locally in theatre, and therefore you don't have the logistical issues of trying to ship uniform and equipment out to troops, and the wastage on both uniforms and equipment in the operations in the climate, the tropical climate, was very, very high. Both uniform and webbing would rot very readily in such conditions and needed to be replaced regularly. So ready supplies of replacement items were a necessity. And therefore, both the uniform we have here and the web equipment, both Indian made, and we'll talk more about the equipment now. This is 1937 pattern equipment, which is essentially set up in battle order. We'll see it's a relatively light load, and we'll talk more about that as we move this round. There's an additional item as well around on the right hip, which isn't typically part of battle order as we have here, and we'll talk about that in a moment as well. But what you can see at the front here is essentially typical battle order. We have the straps coming over the shoulder here and hooking into the top of the pouches, supporting the haversack on the back. And then we have two basic pouches here. These are Indian Mark II basic pouches, produced in 1944, and they have eyelets, drainage eyelets in the bottom, very large drainage eyelets to allow water to drain out of them. A key part of the design, a good improvement over the Indian Mark I pouches. And the waist here, we have the waist belt, which again is a typical 1937 pattern design. An interesting detail here is the buckle is not fully formed as it would be on, say, a British made example. Some of the Indian made equipment is quite crude, particularly when other factories which didn't manufacture web equipment pre-war were brought into manufacturing. Some of the quality control and so forth is not fantastic. It's functional, but quite rough and ready. And it's quite interesting from that point of view, Indian web equipment. There's some sort of eccentric design features or quality control issues that come up from time to time. Buckles not fitting and ends of straps, brass ends of straps not fitting through buckles and things like that. This set goes together quite well, thankfully. So we have the two basic pouches there, the belt, the straps coming down from the haversack, and obviously behind those you have the braces going over the shoulders to support the equipment as well. That's basically what we can see at the front here. So we'll start moving this around now and have a look at some of the other details. Moving on to look at the right hand side of this, we'll start at the top and work our way down as before. You can see here on the side of the hat we have 3 ventilation eyelets there. Sometimes you'd have 2, sometimes there would be more than 3. Just a manufacturing variation, different manufacturers used a different number of eyelets there. Just something that's interesting to note from wartime designs. We have the puggery coming around there. Obviously this side of the brim turned down and the other side turned up. In the field it was common to see these with the brim turned down all the way around to give protection from the sun, of course. Moving down, we can see at the back here the side profile of the haversack carried up on the shoulders there, with the straps coming over the shoulders to support it, and we'll see that in more detail when we look at the back. On the shoulder here, on the epaulets, we have cotton drill jungle green slides that have been used here to display rank, and we have an early form of subdued rank here with the lieutenant's pips, lieutenant's stars being represented by 2 pieces of black wool cloth stitched on. It's quite common in the Far East at this time, interestingly enough, to see rank worn on the shoulders by NCOs as well. So sergeants, corporals and so forth sometimes had shoulder rank made up for wear on the epaulets of the shirt. It's obviously easily removable then for laundering of the shirt. Something to note, obviously the wastage of uniform as well, that could be transferred from one shirt to another as required. So just a point to note here. As I say, rank quite commonly worn on the shoulders in the Far East at the time. Obviously by officers, that's the standard way of doing things. But we do have an early form of subdued rank here with these black cloth squares used to represent rank on the shoulder there. You see the sleeve coming down here, very simple design, opens up the cuff with these 2 buttons so it can be easily rolled up. The sleeves are worn down in this instance. This is quite common to see at the time, but they were worn rolled up at certain points as well, depending on what the situation was. Obviously going to dusk with mosquitoes, the risk of mosquitoes and so forth, sleeves should have been worn rolled down, but even during the daytime it's quite common to see them worn rolled down as well, so we just have that here just to mention. Lifting the arm out of the way, we can see the extra item of web equipment I mentioned. We have a compass pouch carried round on the right hip here, easily accessible of course. This is quite common to see for officers and NCOs at the time, wearing essentially standard web equipment. Of course, for an officer, this is important so as to not differentiate yourself from the men, not make yourself a target, but with the addition of a compass pouch there, allowing them to carry a compass for obviously jungle navigation, map work. So we have that round on the hip there. As I say, another reason for the subdued rank insignia, of course, is to not be easily marked out as an officer. It was very important. It was common not only in Burma at the time, but also in Northwest Europe in the latter half of 1944, moving into 1945. Most officers, most junior officers serving with the men in the front line, easily targeted by the enemy, were not, certainly didn't want to distinguish themselves from the men in a way that was obvious to the enemy and make themselves a target. So the wearing of standard web equipment with the basic pouches at the front as opposed to pistol equipment was very common. And as I say, you then add on something like a compass pouch here, perhaps a map case for those elements of the equipment which couldn't be carried in the basic set as we have here with the 2 basic pouches. We'll move this around now and have a look at the back of the equipment and some of the other items which are carried here. Looking at the back of the mannequin here, we can first of all see the haversack carried up on the back here. This is not particularly heavily loaded in this instance, but would carry things such as the hold-all, the wash kit and so forth in it. You'd have the towel in there, spare socks, the mess tins, that sort of thing. It's not been crammed full with extra rations and so forth though. As you can see, it's not particularly heavily loaded, and there's no ground sheet carried here. We don't have the monsoon cape on the back of the belt or anything. This is pretty lightweight in terms of the kit that was carried at the time. It would depend on specific operations as to what was carried. And of course, there was a lot of motor transport available in the Far East at this time compared to what there had been before. So in terms of the kit that was carried, it was actually possible to reduce the load of infantrymen to a degree as the campaign in Burma continued in late 1944. Down below the belt on the brace ends here, we have the felt covered enamel water bottle in an Indian made carrier. All the web equipment is Indian made, to stress that point here, the haversack as well. This is carried on the back of the equipment rather than round on the hip, because it's more balanced when nothing else is being carried on the other hip to balance it out. So we have that round on the back here. At this time, you do sometimes see in photographs mess tins carried in another carrier on the other hip, and then the bottle round on the right hip or the left hip, whichever way. It's not particularly common, but you do see it in photographs at the time. So I haven't replicated it here, but I just thought I'd mention that. That's the back of the mannequin there. We'll turn this around now and have a look at the left-hand side. And finally, looking at the left-hand side here, again, you can see the 3 ventilation eyelets on the crown of the hat there. We have the snap or press stud there, which secures the brim. We just unfasten this there, you can see. It just snaps up to the side there. Keeps that up out of the way. The idea, of course, for this is if you're bringing a rifle up to the slope, you would need the brim to be snapped up out of the way. As said, in the field, these were quite commonly unbuttoned and allowed to sit down to actually provide protection from the sun. We have the rank displayed on the shoulder again. Other than the lack of the compass pouch, it's basically a mirror image of the other side, so there isn't a huge amount more to talk about here. I've mentioned rifles here. In terms of the weapons carried, it's quite possible to see Mark III Sten, for example, which were commonly issued in Burma at the time. In some units, you would see M1 carbines in use by officers as well, and some would carry rifles, the rifle #1 Mark III Star, for example. So it would really depend on what was available, I suppose, and what was issued, of course. I can't remember off the top of my head which unit it was which acquired M1 carbines, but it was their colonel managed to acquire a number of M1 carbines, and they were issued out to the officers of the unit. So it really depended, as I say, on what was available, what was issued at the time, and sometimes specific unit procurement, shall we say, one way or another. So that's the sort of weapon that could be carried at the time as well. That's the left-hand side, and I think that's everything covered there. So I do hope you found it interesting looking at this. I have to say I find the Far East theatre of the Second World War, particularly in the latter stages of the war, absolutely fascinating, and it's one of my particular pet interests, I guess you could say, and I'm very happy to have all this kit as we have on the Mannequin here, and an extensive collection beyond this as well. And it's nice to get this out on the Mannequin and talk about it again. It's been a little while since I've covered Burma. So thank you for those who voted over on Patreon for this topic. It's been interesting covering this, I have to say. I do hope you found it interesting, as I said before. If you have and you'd like to see more of this sort of thing, please do consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. And whether you're newly subscribing or you've previously subscribed, please do make sure you hit the little bell, the notification button down below. That will of course alert you when I upload future videos. If you really like my uploads and you'd perhaps like the chance to vote on what's going to be covered each month in Mannequin of the Month, do check out Patreon down below, and there is of course a PayPal link as well. But it's the corporal tier over on Patreon that get to vote each month on what's going to be covered. There are generally 3 options, and obviously this topped the poll this month. A huge thank you to everybody who supports the channel using both of those options. As I always say, it is greatly appreciated. Thank you all very much indeed. If you'd like to follow the channel on social media, you can. Facebook, Instagram and Twitter are all linked down below. There will of course be photographs of this posted up over there as well. And if you'd like to get in touch with me but you don't really use social media, there is of course an email address in the description as well. That's everything for this video. So until next time, bye for now.